We have come to the final chapter in the book of Jonah. I know already, some books in the Bible are short, some are not. We've been in this series, Unexpected. We've been going through the book of Jonah, and we finally reached the final chapter. And what we're going to see in this chapter actually is a bit of a surprise. We're going to see Jonah quite angry. And what he's angry about is the mercy of God. That God would be so willing to forgive these rotten Ninevites. But on a more serious note, that God be willing to be merciful to people who bring in so much pain and misery into the world. And so we're going to explore this together. But one thing that I love about this chapter, one thing I love about what we're going to see happen here is the way that God responds to Jonah. God doesn't ignore Jonah. He doesn't just tell Jonah to get over himself or something like that. Rather, God meets Jonah where he's at. He meets Jonah where he's at, in where he's feeling. And God is so beautifully patient with Jonah in this chapter. And God is so beautifully patient with us too. And so that's what I want to explore as we go through chapter 4 today. I want to explore the patience of God and the way that he meets us where we're at. So if there's one thing that you could take away from my message today, I hope that it would be this, that God meets us where we are, but he also desires that we don't just stay where we are. He desires not to leave us there. See, God longs for you and I to come into maturity, to come into being more and more like him. And he's willing to work with us. He's willing to work in us. He's willing to be patient and invite us to become more and more and more like him. He's patient with us, and that's a good thing. At least for me, it's a good thing. That's what we'll see kind of at work in this chapter. And we'll dive in there in just a moment. But what I want to do before we do that is just do a quick recap, just so that we're all on the same page with what's going on in this chapter of Jonah. So, in the story of Jonah. So the book begins with Jonah, who's a prophet of God, being called to go speak to the city of Nineveh and preach against them because of their evil. And unexpectedly, Jonah doesn't go to Nineveh, he goes to Tarshish. Instead of going to the east, Jonah heads due west. He heads in the exact opposite direction to which God called him. And in fact, he even hires a boat in order to get out of there. So he's on this boat and he's on the seas, and God hurls a wind into the seas so that there's a great windstorm in the seas, and everyone's freaking out. Everyone's afraid, but Jonah, he's not afraid, he's asleep at the bottom of the boat. So eventually the sailors figure out that Jonah is the reason for this great storm. And at Jonah's request, they toss him overboard into the seas. And he's sinking and sinking and sinking until he's no longer at the bottom of a boat, he's at the bottom of the seas. And God provides a great fish to swallow him up. And it's in the belly of this fish that Jonah prays to God. He prays a bit of a messy prayer, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago, but it's also a prayer of thankfulness that God saved him in this surprising way. And then God speaks to the fish, and the fish vomits out Jonah onto dry land. And then last week, we talked about or Sheridan shared with us about how Jonah is called to preach to Nineveh a second time. He's called a second time by God to preach to Nineveh. And this time he does. And he goes to Nineveh, which is this remarkably huge city. It's a 3 days journey. And so, of course, Jonah goes 1 day's journey into the city, and he preaches what is in Hebrew a 5-word sermon, and conveniently leaves out what Nineveh's done wrong and who God is and what they should do in response. He just says Nineveh's going to be overturned. But amazingly, the whole city does respond. And the king even recognizes this to such an extent that he sits in the ashes. He sits in the dust. And he commands all the people and even all the animals to wear sackcloth and to cry out to God with strength. And when God sees this, he too turns. He turns from his anger about their evil and he shows them mercy. And if this was a fairy tale, if this was a nice, beautiful story that had a perfect ending, then this would be the end. They all lived happily ever after. But that's not how the Bible tells stories. That's not how life works either. Life is not that neat and tidy. So the story does continue, and there is a surprising ending to this story. And that's what we're going to explore this morning. So I'd like to invite Maria up, who's going to read our first passage, which is the first 4 verses of Jonah.
But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord. "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Is it right for you to be angry?"
Thank you. Okay, so just picture this scene. Remember where we ended just a moment ago in chapter 3. We ended with the people of Nineveh have just turned to God. And all the people and even the animals are dressed in sackcloth. They're kind of sitting on the ground, crying out to God. Even the king is sitting in the ashes. Even the king has humbled himself to that point. He's sitting in the dust. Where's Jonah during all of this? He hasn't left the city yet. In a moment, he's going to leave the city and he's going to make this shelter for himself. But for now, Jonah is here in this city while everyone around him is kind of on the ground, covered in sackcloth, crying out to God with strength. Jonah is standing and with his fists clenched, I imagine, and praying to God through gritted teeth. He's angry. In fact, anger might not even fully describe this feeling. The Hebrew word which is translated angry here is the word chara, which I think is a great word to say when you're angry. Chara. It's most kind of concrete meaning of this word is just to be hot. So, you know, the kind of anger where your body just starts to heat up and your nose flares. It's like you're not just angry, you're enraged. This is the kind of anger that Jonah's feeling. It's the kind of anger that we might feel when we witness injustice, when we see someone we love mistreated. We might feel this kind of burning anger. This is the kind of anger that Jonah is feeling as he stands seeing all these people turn to God, recognize the wrong things that they've done, and turn from the violence which was in their hands. He's feeling this hot anger. So what's going on here? Why is Jonah feeling like this? Well, I think a way of thinking about it might be, have you ever been wronged by someone and then you go to confront them about it and you've got all your best arguments and comebacks ready to go? You know that you're in the right and you are just ready to put them in their place. And then you go up to them and they apologize. They own up to it, they say sorry, and before you get a chance to say that one zinger that you know is going to really show them how wrong they are, they just say sorry and they own up to what they've done, and you've got this hot anger that you need for an argument, but it's over. I feel like something like that is going on here with Jonah. Because, let's not forget who the people of Nineveh are. The people of Nineveh was one of the most important cities in the nation of Assyria, a nation which was known for its brutality and its violence. There are plenty of, if you're interested, morbidly interested maybe, there are plenty of archaeological finds which describe just how brutally violent this nation were, which you can read about. But I think Nahum, the book of Nahum, sums it up well in chapter 3. Nahum says, "Woe to the city of blood," speaking of Nineveh here, "woe to the city of blood, full of lies, full of plunder, never without victims." This is the kind of city that Nineveh was. How would you feel about a city of blood with endless victims? How much do we long for those who do wrong, especially those who do wrong to people that we love and care about? How much do we long for them to be put in their place? So maybe this is why Jonah is full of rage here, because this city of endless victims has experienced the mercy of God. But there's even more to Jonah's response, isn't it? He's not just angry. Jonah is not only enraged about this, but he considers it to be very wrong in the NIV. I mentioned a few weeks ago that the NIV's actually, this translation is softening what's going on in the Hebrew here, because the standard Hebrew word for evil is used here. This act of mercy by God, according to Jonah, was evil. In fact, it was a great evil. I think that we might be able to sympathize with Jonah, with Jonah's anger. We might be able to see that, well, of course you'd be mad about merciless people receiving mercy. But along with that rage comes something more, a judgment that God's actions are evil. It seems to me like Jonah thought that he could control the situation. Jonah thought that when he preached to Nineveh, he could bring about judgment rather than mercy. If he just used the right words and left out some really crucial pieces of information, that he could ensure that Nineveh would receive judgment rather than mercy. It's kind of like Jonah thought that he could control God. He thought that since these Ninevites deserve judgment, he would use God to bring about that judgment rather than mercy. And that would be good and right. And so when Jonah realizes that God shows mercy anyway, Jonah thinks that this is wrong, this is evil. I think Philip Carey in his commentary on Jonah puts this well. He says this, he says, "We must be clear where Jonah gets it wrong. It's not as if we should never desire justice or even celebrate the wrath of God as Nahum does. It is good news when the oppressor is toppled, the terrorist is caught, and the torturer enjoys no impunity. The arrival of justice is heartening for the afflicted. The Lord does indeed take vengeance on his enemies because he's the enemy of all the destroyers of the earth and he destroys them. But the great danger is that instead of rejoicing at the vindication of the afflicted, we self-righteously identify ourselves as the afflicted and the victimized, taking pity on ourselves and not on others, so that in our imagination, the Lord becomes a weapon in our campaign to destroy our enemies, an instrument for our own vengefulness rather than the judge of the whole earth. So it seems like Jonah is trying to be the judge himself. He's trying to determine what is good and evil on his own terms. And so he goes on and he prays. This is the second time that Jonah prays in this book. The first time he was praying in the middle of a fish, and now he's praying in the middle of the city. And it's another kind of messy prayer, you could say. He starts by saying, didn't I say this before? Didn't I tell you this when I was at home? This is why I fled to Tarshish. And we're like, no. Because all of a sudden, we as readers start looking back through the book, right? And we start thinking, wait, where was this? Did I skim read over the part where he said that this is why he fled to Tarshish? Jonah never says why he's fleeing to Tarshish. We don't find out until this moment. Now, it may just simply have been left out of the book, or it may be something where Jonah said it in his heart, so it's kind of like a secret thing that he said, but only God knew. That's possible, but it's still strange, a strange thing for him to say here. But not only is that strange, the reason he gives for fleeing to Tarshish is also a bit bizarre. Jonah fled to Tarshish because he knows God's character. He fled there because he knows what God is like, that God he's actually confident in God's mercy. He knows that God is going to show mercy to the people of Nineveh. And what Jonah does here is he quotes one of the most repeated phrases in all of the Bible. This phrase that is repeated in verse 2, this phrase in verse 2 is repeated all throughout the Bible again and again and again and again to describe the character of God. It first comes up in Exodus chapter 34. And just to briefly set the scene for this verse, God has just rescued his people, Israel, from slavery in Egypt, and he's brought them to Mount Sinai. He's brought them to Mount Sinai so that he can make a covenant with them, so that they can be his people and he can be their God. And Moses, their leader, has gone up the mountain to receive the law from God while all the people are down at the bottom of the mountain. And they're waiting for Moses to come back down. They're waiting and waiting and waiting. And they get tired of waiting. And so they start making idols to worship. We need to remember how serious this is. This is kind of like committing adultery on your wedding night. They are worshiping other gods while they are making a covenant with their God. And so God is understandably angry, but he remembers his promises to the people, and he remembers what he promised their ancestors, and he again turns away from his anger and shows them mercy. And so Moses, after this happens, Moses asks to know what God is like. And this is how God describes himself. He describes himself as the Lord, a God gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. So it's like at the very moment that God was making a commitment to his people, they betrayed him. And instead of, he didn't wipe them out or anything like that. He was faithful to them. And he even revealed himself as the God who is faithful, the God who is merciful. And Jonah knows this. Jonah knows this story, and Jonah knows that this is what God is like. And yet here Jonah seems to be complaining about the very characteristics, about these very characteristics of God. And the irony is, of course, that a couple of chapters ago, Jonah experienced this mercy. Jonah experienced this slow to anger God. As although Jonah ran from God, God was slow to anger. And he graciously rescued Jonah from the seas. I mean, using a great big fish, sure, but Jonah seemed pretty thankful about that rescue all the while. So Jonah is willing to receive that mercy from God, but he's not willing to see that mercy extended to others. And I think that so often we want God's mercy to be just wide enough for me and the people I like, but no wider. Not wide enough for those people who really don't deserve it. So then, as if the story could not get darker, Jonah asks to die. It's kind of like he was unable to run away from God. He was unable to bring judgment upon Nineveh. So how else is a guy supposed to get away from a gracious and compassionate God? Perhaps, according to Jonah, dying is better than living in a world where evil people can just turn to God for mercy. Now, notice how God responds. He responds by asking Jonah a question. He asks, is it right for you to be angry? We're actually going to see God ask Jonah 3 questions throughout this chapter. And it seems like God is meeting Jonah where he's at in each moment with each question. So here Jonah's angry, so he's like, all right, we can work with that. You're angry? Let's talk about that anger. And so he asks, is it right for you to be angry? The word translated right is actually the normal Hebrew word for good. So is it good for you to be angry? It's kind of, God is essentially asking, is your anger doing any good? Because it's not as if anger itself is wrong, because God himself gets angry, but he's slow to anger. So it's not that that's wrong, but what is it that Jonah's anger is leading to? And what is it that Jonah's anger is responding to? I think it's a question for us too. What makes us angry? And does our anger lead to anything good? So God's meeting Jonah where he's at. He's asking this question, and he's inviting Jonah to kind of re-examine the way that he's thinking about what just happened. So how is Jonah going to respond? Well, invite up Charlie now. He's going to read our next passage. Thanks, Charlie. Oh, sorry.
Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself shelter, sat in its shade and waited to see what would happen to the city. But the Lord God provided a leafy plant, and he made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed up the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head, so he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said, "and I'm so angry I wish I were dead."
Thank you. That's right. So how does Jonah respond? Well, he first responds by getting out of there. He leaves the city, he walks away, and he goes and makes a shelter. Jonah responds to God's first question by camping out, just so that he could see what might happen to the city. Who knows, right? Now, there's an irony here with this shelter that Jonah makes that maybe you've missed, because the shelter that Jonah makes is in Hebrew a sukkah, and the main time that this word appears in the Old Testament is in reference to the festival of Sukkot, or sometimes it's translated the festival of booths or the festival of tabernacles. So Israel regularly celebrated these different kinds of festivals, and this particular festival, the point of it was for Israel to make shelters out in the desert to remind them of the time that they spent wandering in the wilderness. Now, there's a lot to say about that festival, but for our purposes, one thing that I want to point out is that for this festival, Israel was supposed to invite everyone along. Everyone was invited to join in this festival, not only their sons and daughters, but also their servants and the orphans and the widows and the foreigners, those of the other nations who were dwelling among them. Even those people were invited to participate in this festival. And in fact, the prophet Zechariah takes this even further. He sees a coming day where everyone from all the nations who were enemies of Israel were going to be celebrating this festival together with Israel. So it was supposed to be this image, this shelter that Jonah built is filled with all this imagery of the other nations being included and celebrating alongside Israel. And yet here, Jonah's sitting by himself, not with others, by himself in a self-made shelter. And he seems to be hoping for fire to fall from heaven upon that nation over there, right? Sorry, guys. Not you guys. You see, that seems to be the desire. So there's this irony of like, what's going on here? Jonah seems to be in this real low point. But amazingly, God hasn't given up on Jonah here. It seems like God sees this as an opportunity. He provides a plant for Jonah, and he makes it grow up over him to be a shade and to ease him from his discomfort. And Jonah loves it. Jonah's stoked about the plant. It says that he was very happy. It's the only time in the whole story that Jonah's actually happy about something. So God's like, cool, we can work with that. But if God's goal was just to make Jonah happy, then this would do the job. But it seems like God wants more for Jonah than just his momentary happiness. So he also provides a worm to chew up the plants and an east wind, which likely blows away that shelter that Jonah had made. And the plant that he was stoked about withers and dies, and Jonah wants to do the same. So now God asks him a second question. At first, God asked Jonah about his anger over Nineveh. Jonah was angry over Nineveh, so he asked him about that, and Jonah got no response. God got no response from Jonah. But God has now found something that Jonah's happy about, something that he's stoked about, this plant, and God can work with that. So he asks, is it right or is it good for you to be angry about the plant? And Jonah says, it is right. So finally, we have something other than himself, which Jonah cares about. Granted, the plant is, he probably cares about the plant because it gives him shade, but that's all right. That's enough for God. It seems like God is just seeking some seed of selflessness in Jonah that he can work with, that he can grow on. And so he's meeting Jonah where he's at, but he desires not to leave him there. And now we're going to see God's final question for Jonah, and it's actually going to be a question for us too. So I'd like to invite Maria up again to read this final passage.
But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?"
Sorry, sneaking around. Thank you so much. All right, so here's the final question that God gives to Jonah. It seems like the purpose of this plan was not just to give Jonah a shade for his head. It was that, but it was more than that. It's like God is using the plan as a kind of object lesson for Jonah. And it seems like God is using the plan to help Jonah to empathize with him, with God. It's actually quite remarkable because God does not need Jonah's permission or empathy for his mercy upon Nineveh. God doesn't owe Jonah an explanation. God doesn't owe Jonah anything. And yet here, God is so good and so patient and so committed to bringing his people into maturity, into his own likeness, that he meets us where we're at. And he just works with what he's got. And he invites us to see things the way that he sees things. So for Jonah, it's the plant. He cares about this plant that he had no hand in cultivating, that sprang up to life as quickly as it withered and died, and yet Jonah cares about it. And it's good that Jonah cares about it. Yeah, it's good that Jonah's on the side of life and flourishing rather than death and perishing. But what about the city, right? What about the city of Nineveh? Notice how God describes this city. He describes it in escalating terms. So not only is it a great city, but it's also a great city with 120,000 people in it. Not only that, but those people don't know their right from their left. And not only that, but there's also many animals. So this is a city that God really cares about. It's like the plant is important because it gives Jonah shade for his head. So Jonah cares about it for that. But God cares about this city because look at all the life that is within the city. And the people of Nineveh, they're described as those who can't tell their right hand from their left, or just more literally, they can't tell their right from their left. They can't distinguish between right and left. This is a Hebrew way of describing children who haven't been trained up in the way that they should go. Now, it doesn't mean that the people of Nineveh are innocent. Even the people of Nineveh recognize that they've done wrong. They turn from the violence which is in their hands. But it does mean that these are people who keep on making the wrong choices. These are people who keep on running into the same walls. In other words, these are people who are lost and without a guide. And that makes them the perfect object for God's mercy, the perfect receivers of God's mercy. God is a God who cares for the lost and the learning, those people who need mercy. So it's not just the people though, it's the animals too. Animals is actually the last word in the book. The final word of the book of Jonah is animals. God cares about them too. And in Psalm 36, it says, "You, Lord, preserve both people and animals." That's exactly what we're seeing here. Nineveh's turning away from violence would have also been a mercy for the animals. So I'd like to invite the worship team up as I wrap up here, because the book ends with a question. But this question, it goes unanswered. There's no response from Jonah. We don't know what Jonah said in response. So what I think that means is that this question then becomes a question for us. And Jonah, as DJ said earlier, becomes a mirror. We can see ourselves in the person of Jonah. Should God not have concern for the great city of Nineveh? Should God not have concern for the Ninevites in our world, for those in our world, in our lives, who actively go out of their way to bring about pain and misery? Now, of course, we probably know the answer to that question intellectually. I think that's not the point here. It seems like Jonah could give the right answer here. I think that what God is wanting to do is for that answer to sink from our heads to our hearts. And for us to consider, are there people in our world who you'd struggle to see receive God's mercy? Are there people in your lives where you would struggle to see them turn to God and receive mercy? Is God inviting you to change the way you think about some people in the world? Maybe it's people in your world personally. Maybe it's beyond that. But this is the question that I invite you as we enter into a time of worship. Could I invite you to listen to God? Or even just, if you'd rather, you just reflect on this question, wherever you're at. But is God inviting you to change the way you think about some people in the world? I encourage you to do that as we enter into a time of worship.